Why is Putin losing the war against Ukraine? The biggest threat to peace and security in Europe since the end of the Cold War is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, gave a strange and occasionally insane speech on February 21, 2022, outlining a lengthy number of complaints as the reason for the special military operation that was launched the next day. The address focused on a much more fundamental issue, the legitimacy of Ukrainian identity and statehood itself. These complaints included the long-running disagreement over NATO expansion and the design of the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe. The emphasis on the enduring unity of Eastern Slavs Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, who all trace their ancestry to the medieval Kievan Rus Commonwealth, and the suggestion that the modern states of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus should share a political destiny, both now and in the future, were reflections of a worldview Putin had long expressed. The flip side to that perspective is the assertion that the distinctive identities of Ukraine and Belarus are the result of foreign manipulation, and that the West is now imitating Russia's imperial enemies by exploiting these two countries as a component of an anti-Russia effort. Perhaps Russia is chanting, "Victory shall be ours," but things appear very differently in the real world. Ukrainian soldiers were pushing within the territories that the president of Russia had just taken as he signed his illegitimate annexation treaties in the Kremlin. To avoid being drafted to participate in a conflict that is getting worse, hundreds of thousands of men have been fleeing Russia. And since the situation on the ground is so dire, Mr. Putin and his supporters have changed their original narrative of the denazification of Ukraine and the defense of Russian speakers to one of an existential struggle against the collective West. That is the reality, and it is not on Russia's side at all. Ukraine is Putin's preferred battleground to achieve that. Even when his goals seem incredibly elusive, he doesn't seem in the mood to compromise. There were several important calculations that the Kremlin was using that did not work out, and it doesn't appear like Putin has a plan B other than to keep sending people to the front lines in the hopes that the sheer volume of troops will stop Ukraine from making additional advances. An important change is being forced to the front. Additionally, Vladimir Putin keeps referring to his invasion as a special military operation and describes it as being of limited size and duration. Even though it didn't directly affect them, many Russians were able to accept and even support it. However, the activation of military reserves has made a peril that was formerly far away and impersonal into something that's now very close and personal. Regional politicians are scrambling to call up as many men as they can to exceed their quotas in a Soviet-style competition. This is a pivotal time. The war only recently began for the vast majority of Russians just a few months ago. People from the suburbs and smaller cities made up the majority of the fatalities in the first few months. The coffins will eventually return to Moscow and St. Petersburg, though, as a result of mobilization. The wives and mothers of the new recruits, who did not immediately head for the borders when the mobilization was announced, have created reams of social media discussion in response to the call-up. Poor food, old weapons, and a lack of basic medical supplies are some of the conditions described in some of their posts and films made by the soldiers themselves. The women talk of sending tampons to treat the men's wounds and sanitary towels to pack their boots. The governor of the Kursk area has referred to the circumstances in several military formations as absolutely horrible, even mentioning a uniform shortage. Such information cast doubt on one of Vladimir Putin's most cherished assertions, that he's transformed the Russian military into a capable fighting force that patriotic citizens will want to join. Most recruits' wives, however, appear to be concentrating on supporting their troops for the time being. We're at the stage where a sizable portion of Russian society still believes that Russia is a great power combating NATO in Ukraine, and sending tampons, socks, and toothbrushes to the mobilized is a sign of patriotism. However, the mishandled mobilization and Russia's military gaffe are encouraging more well-known figures to voice their opinions. Liberals were detained after condemning the invasion of Ukraine, and many of them are still imprisoned. And it's unlawful to even refer to it as a war. Years before the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia had captured 6,500 square miles of eastern Ukraine and unlawfully annexed Crimea, making up nearly 7% of the country's 233,000 square miles. The majority of the Kherson region in the south and all of the Luhansk province in the east, according to Ukrainian officials, are now under Russian control. Although Western analysts believe both Russia and Ukraine have suffered significant losses, both countries have kept the number of their military casualties a closely guarded secret. With every missile strike, burst of gunfire, and report of horrors, the grim ledger of Russia's invasion of Ukraine gets longer and longer every day. Both sides have suffered significant military casualties. It is estimated that up to 25,000 Russians and 9,000 Ukrainians have died. Additionally, a sizable number of heavy and armored weapons have been lost by Russia. According to Colin Kahl, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon, the loss of armored vehicles by Russian forces is most likely between 3,000 and 4,000. With more than 5,587 verified deaths, Ukrainian civilians have also paid a high price. The actual toll is thought to be in the tens of thousands. There are now more than 6.6 million refugees worldwide. And, as said earlier, the Russian military and their proxies have recently gained control of 20% of Ukraine's territory. Ukraine has already spent at least $113.5 billion on the damage, and reconstruction might cost well over $200 billion. Above all, the Russian conflict in Ukraine is a terrible human tragedy and an attack on the country's society and economy. But as a result of its heinous war decision, Russia will also have to pay dearly. Of course, it is impossible to determine with any degree of accuracy how much the war cost Russia. However, we can look at some indicators to show the magnitude of the costs. The cost of the military will be at least $110 billion or more, but the impact on Russia's economy and its isolation from the rest of the world will be much more significant. Russia's GDP was predicted to expand by a total of around 5% in 2022 to 23 before the commencement of the war, but as a result of the invasion and the huge package of sanctions that followed, it's now predicted to decrease by 8 to 10% during that time. Russia's GDP might have increased by 15% in 2023 if there had been no conflict. According to the average exchange rate from 2021, this will result in a $270 billion GDP loss in 2023 alone. The cost of actually waging the war in terms of the defense budget is the most evident expense. By 2022, defense spending will have increased by at least 1,200 billion RUB from the pre-war plan figure. The Russian government is increasing its defense spending for the years 2023 to 2025 by a total of 2,600 billion RUB over what was originally budgeted. Therefore, the country's defense spending has climbed since the war began by at least 3,700 billion RUB, or almost $53 billion at the official average exchange rate for this year. As not every budget spending is itemized, the overall expenditure amount may potentially be higher. It's also feasible that spending levels will exceed the budgeted amount. After breaching Russian defenses on the west bank of the Dnieper River near Kherson, Ukrainian troops on the battlefield have continued to advance. Residents of Kherson are being evacuated to the river's east bank by a Russian-installed authority. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the evacuation could be in support of Russian intentions to blow up the Kakova Dam to hide their withdrawal. Recently, Russian forces have started constructing defenses and fortifications in the cities of Kherson and Novokakova, both of which are located on the east bank of the river. In recent weeks, Ukrainian forces have attacked bridges, ferries, and pontoons to render Russian positions on the west bank of the river unsustainable and compel a withdrawal. The most recent conflict comes after a significant Russian defeat in the east. When Ukraine drove Russian troops out of the Kharkiv region at the beginning of September, it reclaimed 6,000 square kilometers of the Russian land. Izium and Kupiansk, two important towns, were evacuated by Russian forces, who claimed that doing so would allow them to regroup. For Russian soldiers in the Donbass, both towns served as important logistical centers. Russia is failing in its conflict with Ukraine. That's all for today, guys. Please like and subscribe to this channel for more.